In this town, no one locks their doors at night not because it's safe, but because they all share the same grim secret. They never sleep. Instead, they gather in the shadows watching, waiting. The reason why? That's the part no one dares to explain. I woke up in a bed that wasn't mine, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a damp blanket. Outside, there was no sound, no wind, no birds, not even the hum of distant cars. Just silence so thick it made my ears ring. The last thing I remembered was the storm, its relentless rain blurring my windshield as I tried to find my way back to the highway. I'd taken a wrong turn, driven for hours, and then blank. The room smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. My heart began to pound as I sat up, my boots still on my feet, as though I'd collapsed into the bed moments after arriving. Only I had no memory of walking in. When I stepped outside, the street was eerily pristine. Neatly trimmed lawns framed rows of old, weathered houses. Everything was so still it looked like a staged photo too perfect to be real. But the people, they were the first thing that didn't fit. They stood in clusters on porches and sidewalks, every single one staring directly at me. Their eyes didn't dart away when I glanced at them. They didn't look embarrassed or curious. They just stared. Long, unwavering stares that made my skin crawl. A woman in a floral dress gave me a wide smile as I walked past. "Hello," she said cheerfully. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, told another story. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off their gazes, but they didn't stop watching. An old man blocked my path. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't fight it," he whispered. His cracked lips curled into a grimace. "You're here now." "What do you mean?" I stammered, trying to pull away. But his grip tightened. "You'll see soon enough," he said, releasing me. He shuffled off without another word, leaving me frozen in the middle of the street, as every eye remained locked on me. The innkeeper's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We leave the windows open," she said, her voice flat, almost rehearsed. "It's tradition. Helps you sleep better." I didn't argue. Something about the way her hands trembled as she handed me the key made my skin prickle. She turned and walked away quickly, her steps echoing down the empty hallway. My room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single lamp that cast long, flickering shadows. The window, as promised, was wide open, letting in the chill of the night. I paced for hours, unable to relax. The silence outside felt oppressive, unnatural. Every now and then I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, quick, fleeting shapes darting past the open window. When I finally sat on the edge of the bed, something slid under the door. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly. My breath caught as I unfolded it. In shaky, uneven handwriting, it read, "Don't close your eyes for too long." A shiver ran down my spine. I yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. The light above flickered once and went out. My pulse thundered as I bolted the door shut and moved a chair in front of it. At midnight, the whispers began. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls. I crept to the window, peeking out into the street below. They were there, at least a dozen townsfolk, standing perfectly still. They were all looking up, their faces pale in the moonlight, their mouths moving silently in unison. I grabbed the chair and threw it aside, flinging open the door. When I reached the street, they were gone. No footsteps, no sound, just the cold wind brushing against my face, whispering things I couldn't understand. The morning light brought no comfort. The townsfolk I had seen chanting under the moon were now sweeping porches, trimming hedges, and greeting one another like nothing had happened. My chest tightened as I walked among them. Every smile they offered felt like a mask stretched too tight. I stopped a woman on the corner, her basket of wilted flowers trembling in her hands. "What were you all doing last night?" I demanded. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered, darting past me. "Last night," she repeated. "You must have been dreaming." Happens sometimes when you're new here. Then she walked away, humming a tuneless melody under her breath. As I wandered deeper into the town, I noticed something else. No clocks, no wristwatches, no bells tolling the hour. The sun seemed stuck, unmoving in the sky. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed, but the townsfolk didn't seem to notice. "When does the library open?" I asked another passerby. "When it's time," he said simply, and turned his back on me. The library was old, its wooden door groaning as I pushed it open. The smell of dust and damp paper filled the air. I pulled a random book from the shelf, the leather binding rough against my fingers. But when I opened it, the pages were blank except for a single line, repeated endlessly. "We are watching." "Isn't it wonderful?" a voice said behind me. I spun around. The librarian, a gaunt man with deep-set eyes, was smiling. "The words remind us of what we must never forget," he said. "We always watch the newcomers." My stomach churned. When I reached for my phone to call for help, my pockets were empty. "Looking for something?" the librarian asked, his grin widening. I bolted back to the inn as the shadows lengthened. The townsfolk were gathering in small groups, murmuring to each other, their voices low but rising like a distant tide. By the time I locked my door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the chair under the knob. When the first knock came, I froze. It was soft, hesitant, but deliberate. I stood there, staring at the door, the sound reverberating through the room. Then came the second knock, louder this time. My heart thundered in my chest. "Who's there?" I choked out, but the only answer was silence. That's when I noticed her. In the corner of the room, a little girl sat with her knees pulled to her chest. Her dress was faded, her face pale and drawn, and she clutched a stuffed bear to her chest. "They like it when you sleep," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, barely audible. "Don't let them touch you." I stumbled backward, but when I turned to grab her, she was gone, just the empty corner where she had been. I ran to the window, my breath catching as I saw them again. The townsfolk stood even closer. Now, just beneath the street lamp. Their faces were still, their eyes glassy, but this time, their mouths were wide open in soundless, gaping grins. I had to get out. The woods were dense, the trees like jagged claws blocking out the stars. I ran until my legs burned, but every path I took looped back to the same clearing, where the inn stood like a monolith in the dark. I collapsed at the edge of the trees, too exhausted to move. A single voice whispered in the wind, soft but unmistakable, "Stay awake." The knock came just after midnight, soft but insistent. I flinched, my pulse spiking as I stared at the door. The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, pressing in closer. "It's me," a familiar voice hissed. "Let me in, quickly." It was the old man from the street. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the lock. When I finally opened the door, he slipped inside, his movements jerky, like he was pulling against an invisible weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Eerie." He pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing deep scars, jagged, parallel lines running across his chest. "This is what happens when you try to sleep," he said, his voice shaking. "The Watcher doesn't forgive." "The Watcher," I repeated, my throat dry. He nodded, his eyes wild. "The entity that owns this town. It feeds on us, on our fear, on our need for rest. If you close your eyes for too long, it takes you." My skin prickled as he spoke. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something impossibly tall and gaunt flickered at the edge of my vision, gone the moment I tried to focus on it. My stomach churned. "The Watcher sees all," he muttered, almost to himself. "And the town survives because we never stop watching." Outside the window, the townsfolk had gathered again, their faces unnervingly blank. Their lips moved in unison, whispering words I couldn't make out. "What happens if we don't watch?" I asked, but the old man only shook his head, his expression all hollow. He left as abruptly as he'd come, leaving behind only silence and a growing sense that something was closing in. The whispers never stopped. They followed me through the next day, low and guttural, just at the edge of hearing. The townsfolk seemed even stranger now, smiles that stretched too wide, eyes that seemed to follow me everywhere. By the time night fell, my exhaustion had turned to desperation. My eyelids felt like lead, but the fear of what would happen if I closed them kept me going. I paced the room, muttering to myself, trying to drown out the whispers. That's when I noticed the trapdoor. It was hidden under the corner of the rug, the wood warped there and stained as though something wet had seeped through. Prying it open took all my strength. A ladder led into the darkness below, the air heavy with damp and decay. I climbed down, each creak of the wood making my stomach twist. The chamber was small, the walls covered in carvings. The crude images showed figures, standing in circles, their eyes carved into grotesque spirals. In the center of the room sat a journal, its cover worn and brittle. The handwriting inside was frantic, each page more erratic than the last. The final entry was scrawled in thick, uneven strokes: to escape is to see the watcher. To see it is to become it. A chill ran through me as I read the words. When I looked up, the carvings on the walls seemed to shift, their hollow eyes staring back at me. My breath came in short gasps as the room felt smaller, darker. Above me, the whispers grew louder, no longer outside my hearing. They were inside my head. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the whispers, the sleeplessness had all pushed me to the edge. I needed answers. I needed it to stop. I waited until the town fell into its strange, suffocating silence. Then I stepped into the woods. The trees loomed like jagged teeth, their branches clawing at the sky. Shadows twisted unnaturally, pulling away from my flashlight's beam as I walked deeper. When I saw it, my knees buckled. The watcher was impossibly tall, its body shifting like smoke, its face a constantly morphing void of features. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. Its presence was crushing, its hollow gaze pulling every thought from my mind. A voice filled my head, not words, but emotions: fear, hunger, endless vigilance. The watcher fed on it all. It offered me a choice: stay and join the town, or take its place and end the cycle. I didn't answer. My heart pounded as I realized there was no escape. The watcher loomed before me, its form ever shifting, its hollow gaze pulling at something deep inside me, something I didn't even know I had. Its voice wasn't a sound but a sensation, a weight crushing every corner of my mind. Choose, it demanded, though the word was a feeling, not a command. I sank to my knees, trembling. If I take your place, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Does it end? Will they be free? The watcher didn't move, but the oppressive air around me seemed to shift. Its silence was an answer, a cruel, unyielding truth. I knew the risk, but I couldn't keep running. I couldn't live like this. Maybe, just maybe, I could save them. I nodded, my breath hitching as its void-like form descended toward me. The moment its presence touched mine, I felt my body dissolve, not pain, but an unraveling, as though I'd never been real to begin with. Every memory, every thought slipped through my fingers like smoke. My limbs disappeared, then my face, and finally my eyes. But my mind stayed, and so did the hunger. I was everywhere now, a shadow threading through the town, their fears and whispers feeding something new inside me. I tried to scream, but the sound only echoed through the woods. The townsfolk, once terrified, now smiled, rejoicing at my absence, believing the nightmare was over. The next day, a new car rolled into town. A stranger stepped out, confused and weary, just like I had been. The cycle had begun again. I watched from the treetops, unseen but omnipresent, and for the first time I felt the weight of eternity. I was the watcher now, And I was hungry. I don't remember how long it's been. Minutes? Hours? Years? Time doesn't exist for me anymore. There is only the town, and the endless, gnawing hunger that binds me to it. From the shadows of the forest, I see everything. The villagers go about their lives, their smiles, tight, and their gazes always glancing toward the edges of the woods, where I wait. They know. I'm here, though they pretend otherwise. Their fear nourishes me, even when they try to hide it. But it's the newcomer I'm drawn to now. He stands in the center of the town square, just like I once did, confused, scared, searching for a way out. I can feel his thoughts, the hope he clings to, the certainty that he'll be the one to escape. It tastes sweet. The villagers smile as they surround him, their faces calm, their eyes empty. The ritual is beginning again. They'll let him run, let him fight, let him scream into the night. But it won't matter. He'll end up right back here, in this cursed little town, where I'll always be watching. I try to resist hunger, but it's no use. It isn't just my prison, it's my purpose now. I stretch my shadow toward him, invisible but inescapable. His fear feeds me as he turns to look into the forest. He doesn't see me. Not yet. But he will. And then I'll see him. Forever. If you're still reading this, you've already looked too long. The Watcher thrives on attention, on your attention. Every time you share this story, every time you remember it, you give it power. So, ask yourself, are you really alone right now? Or is something watching from the darkness, waiting for you to close your eyes? Every time I stop and turn around, there's nothing there, no footprints, no shadows, just emptiness. But the sound of its breath grows louder, closer, and more menacing with every step I take. Whatever is following me isn't human, and I can feel it watching. The woods were silent in a way that felt unnatural. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of wildlife, just my footsteps crunching on the dirt path. I wanted to believe the isolation would bring me peace, but the further I walked from the stream, the more the air seemed to press in on me. Then I heard it, a breath, low and deliberate, exhaling just behind me. I froze mid-step, my pulse hammering. Turning sharply, I scanned the path. Nothing, only the faint outline of trees disappearing into the deepening dusk. I stood still, listening, but the sound was gone. Maybe it was my own breathing. Maybe I was hearing things. I forced myself to laugh, the sound brittle in the oppressive silence. It's just the woods, I muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. But when I started walking again, the breathing returned, closer this time. Every hair on my body stood on end. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was following me. I broke into a brisk walk, then a run. The cabin wasn't far. I just needed to get inside, lock the door, and the breathing stopped. The silence that replaced it was suffocating, worse than the sound itself. I reached the cabin, slammed the door behind me, and leaned against it, trembling. The lock clicked into place, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for anything to happen. But there was nothing. Just the heavy quiet of the woods outside and the weight of my own fear pressing on my chest. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too scared to sleep, ears straining for the sound of a breath that might never come again. Morning brought little comfort. The sunlight creeping through the blinds did nothing to dispel the weight in the air, nor the gnawing unease in my chest. I told myself I'd overreacted last night. The woods can play tricks on your senses. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stepped outside, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. But as soon as I reached the porch, I stopped cold. The windows, there were smears on them, long handprints stretched across the glass. The shape of the fingers was all wrong, too long, too thin. My stomach twisted. I hadn't been imagining things. I scanned the porch for any other signs, and that's when I saw it. a small locket resting neatly on the wooden planks. I knew that locket. My chest tightened as I picked it up. The delicate chain, the familiar dent on the clasp, it was mine. Or rather, it had been mine. I'd lost it years ago when I was a kid. Memories flooded back, unbidden. The last time I'd seen this locket was on Sarah, my childhood best friend. She'd borrowed it the day she disappeared. We were playing in these woods, caught in a storm. I ran home. She didn't. I clutched the locket, my hands trembling. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. My breath itched as a dark thought crawled into my mind. Someone had been here. Someone who knew about Sarah. Or something. The handprints on the window seemed darker now, more menacing in the daylight. I backed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the woods were waiting for me to remember something I tried desperately to forget. The night descended faster than I expected, swallowing the cabin in a blackness so complete it felt unnatural. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Then I heard it again, the breathing. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. My chest tightened as the sound deepened, growing louder with each exhale, as if something unseen was standing inches away, watching. I clutched the flashlight, my hands trembling, and scanned the room. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved, but the sound didn't stop. It was circling me, taunting me. A sudden thud from the window made me jump. I whipped the light toward it, and there it was, an outline of a figure, barely visible in the moonlight. Its shape was wrong, too thin, too tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring in at me. "Who are you?" I whispered, but the words barely left my mouth. My throat was too tight, my voice strangled by fear. The figure dissolved into the night as if it had never been there. Shaking, I stepped outside, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The woods were empty, still, but the air felt alive, charged with something I couldn't see. The breathing was gone. Back inside, I tried to calm myself, but when I glanced at the floor near my bed, my heart stopped. Scratched into the wood were 4 jagged words: "Why did you run?" The message was fresh, the splinters sharp. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. Couldn't be real, could it? By the time dawn broke, I felt like a hollow shell of myself. I hadn't slept, couldn't eat, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I needed answer, something, anything to explain what was happening. I drove to the nearest town, the locket clutched tightly in my pocket like a talisman. The bartender at a small, dusty tavern looked at me strangely when I mentioned the woods. "You're staying out there?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. I nodded, and after a pause, he leaned in closer. "People around here don't go near those woods. There's something wrong with them. They say it's the home of the silent one." He glanced around the room as if afraid someone might hear him. "It doesn't leave footprints only. Breath. It follows people who carry guilt. It knows your secrets, feeds on them." His words struck like a hammer. My mind flashed back to the scratches on the floor, the locket, and the question carved into the wood: "Why did you run?" I hadn't thought about Sarah in years. I had buried the memory so deep it felt like a lifetime ago. But the truth came rushing back now. I had run. I had left her there, alone in the storm. I didn't even look back. She was my best friend, and I left her. "What happens if it chooses you?" I whispered. The bartender's face darkened. "It doesn't stop until you face what you've done, or until it takes you." The drive back to the cabin was suffocating. My chest felt like it was caving in under the weight of his words. This thing wasn't random. It was here for me. The woods felt alive as I stepped into them, the air heavier than before. Shadows twisted. Unnaturally, branches clawing at the darkening sky. The breathing was everywhere now, circling me, pulling me towards something unseen. Then I saw it, the treehouse. It stood exactly as we left it, untouched by time. My stomach churned as I climbed the ladder, each creak echoing in the silent forest. Inside, words were scratched deep into the walls you left me. Why my hands shook as I found her backpack in the corner, the same one she had that night. Inside was everything, her notebook, water bottle, and our picture. She'd been here, alone, waiting for me. The breathing surged, louder than ever. I turned slowly, the shadows shifting around me, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. She emerged from the shadows, her face Sarah's but twisted, wrong. "You left me," she whispered, her voice layered with a deep, guttural growl. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice trembling. Her head tilted, her eyes hollow. "You promised." Tears blurred my vision. "I know. I was scared. I'm sorry." The shadows around her rippled, her form flickering between Sarah and something monstrous. "Sorry isn't enough," she said, stepping closer. The treehouse walls pulsed, the scratched words glowing faintly. The breathing swelled loud and all-consuming. I clutched the locket in my hand, trembling. It was the only thing I had left of her, and I knew what I had to do. The locket burned in my hand, icy yet alive. "Take it," I whispered. "Take everything." I dropped it on the floor and lit a match. The flame flickered but caught, the locket glowing, red hot as the fire consumed it. She screamed, a sound that shook the walls, her form unraveling into shadows. The breathing stopped, the air falling silent. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming. Back at the cabin, I thought it was over. But the locket waited for me, charred and whole, on the table. And in the quiet, the breathing returned, soft but unmistakable. The drive away from the cabin was eerily quiet. I should have felt relief, but the silence pressed down on me like a weight. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again and again, expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. But the reflection showed only shadows, deep and impenetrable. Then I heard it. The breathing, soft, deliberate, and coming from just behind my shoulder. My stomach twisted as I glanced down, and there it was, the locket, charred and cracked, resting in the passenger seat. My chest tightened. I had burned it. I saw it burn. My hands gripped the wheel as the car felt smaller, the air thicker. The breathing grew louder, closer, and my vision blurred with tears. I couldn't run, couldn't escape. This wasn't over. It would never be over. And as you finish reading this, ask yourself, are you sure you're alone? Or is something breathing behind you, waiting for you to notice? If you dare, share this story. But know that every retelling gives it a way to reach someone new. They told me to never answer the intercom after midnight, no matter what I hear. But tonight the static crackled to life, and a voice called my name low, distorted, and unmistakably human. My hands tremble as I stare at the intercom, knowing I shouldn't answer. But it's still calling. The clinic felt like a tomb. Midnight shifts were always quiet, but tonight, the silence pressed on me like a weight. I tried to distract myself with paperwork, the hum of the fluorescent lights, my only companion. Then it happened, the intercom crackled to life, its static sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness. "Evelyn," a voice said, low and distorted. I froze, pen slipping from my hand. It wasn't possible. The intercom hadn't worked in months. It was supposed to be disconnected. My name came. Again, more insistent, "Come to room 6. My stomach churned. The rules flashed in my mind: never answer the intercom after midnight. At the time, I thought it was some sick joke, a warning from superstitious colleagues. But now, with the voice echoing through the empty clinic, it didn't feel funny. It felt personal. I forced myself to ignore it, locking my eyes on the desk. But the intercom buzzed again, louder. This time, the voice sharp and agitated. Evelyn, come to room 6. My pulse thundered in my ears. Room 6 was locked, had been for years ever since. No, I couldn't think about that night. Not now. I stood, my legs shaky, and glanced down the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, shadows, stretching and pulling in unnatural ways. Come to room 6. The intercom crackled one last time, then fell silent. But the air still felt heavy, alive. I couldn't stay at my desk anymore. I had to know what was happening. The hallway stretched ahead, longer than it should have been, the dim lighting turning every shadow into something sinister. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, each step louder than the last. I kept telling myself this was nothing, just a glitch, a prank, but my chest tightened with every step toward room 6. Halfway down the hall, I saw it. A framed photo on the receptionist's desk. I leaned closer, my blood running cold. It was me, sitting at the very desk I'd just left. The timestamp was tonight. My breath quickened. This wasn't possible. No one had been here to take that photo. I backed away, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly unbearable. When I reached room 6, the door was ajar, swinging slightly as though someone had just passed through. My hand hesitated on the handle, my palms slick with sweat. Inside, the room was pristine, untouched. A single sheet of paper sat on the exam table. I stepped closer, my heart thudding. It was an intake form. My name was scrawled at the top, followed by one chilling word: admitted. The intercom crackled behind me. I turned sharply, the sound slicing through the suffocating. Quiet. We're waiting for you, the voice said, sharp and almost playful. I spun around, but the room was empty. The paper fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. My name echoed in my mind as the intercom buzzed again, louder, angrier. The intercom fell silent, but the air in the clinic felt heavier, suffocating. I bolted from room 6, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the hallway. My breath hitched as I glanced behind me, nothing but shifting shadows. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. I reached the break room and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with trembling hands. My phone shook as I fumbled to call anyone, but the screen showed no signal. Grabbed the landline. Dead. My heart pounded in my ears as the overhead lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and just outside the door. The shadows under the door frame shifted, darker than they should have been. A raspy, shallow breath followed as, though whatever stood there struggled to contain itself. My knees buckled as the doorknob rattled, the metallic clatter cutting through the oppressive silence. I grabbed a chair, clutching it like a shield, and waited. The light above me flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. My breath hitched as the doorknob stilled. Whatever it was, it had stopped. I had stopped. Silence hung thick in the air until, finally, the footsteps retreated, each step softer until they faded into nothing. I exhaled, my relief short-lived as the intercom buzzed again. This time, the voice was clearer, almost mocking. Don't make me come find you, Evelyn. The voice on the intercom churned in my head as I crept through the hallways. Every shadow seemed alive, watching. I found a flashlight in the supply closet and headed to the storage room, the only place I hadn't searched. It felt safer moving than waiting. The storage room reeked of mildew, the air thick with decay. Rows of dusty files filled the shelves, and as I flipped through them, my stomach twisted. Patient names, dozens of them, no discharge dates. The names stirred a faint, sick recognition. I remembered these people. Some were colleagues who vanished without warning. Others were patients who'd come in but never returned. At the bottom of the pile was a file with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single note scrawled in jagged handwriting: midnight, room 6. I staggered back as fragmented memories assaulted me. Years ago, I'd been in this clinic as a patient after a car accident. Room 6 was where I'd been treated, but something felt wrong about the memory, like it had been warped and rewritten. The faint whisper of a voice snapped me back, "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the room. Nothing was there but the door, slammed shut on its own, trapping me. The intercom buzzed again, this time loud and distorted. The voice growled, "We're losing patience." Evelyn. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The walls groaned as I stumbled out of the storage room, clutching the flashlight like it might somehow protect me. The hallway twisted unnaturally, longer than it had ever been, the lights above flickering in erratic bursts. Shadows darted along the edges of my vision, but when I turned to look, they vanished. I tried every door, my fingers fumbling over handles, but each one slammed shut the moment I touched it. The building pulsed with something alive, like it was breathing, the air growing colder with every step I took. The intercom crackled again, louder this time, the voice no longer one but many. A chorus of whispers and screams merged into one horrifying chant, "Evelyn. Evelyn. Evelyn." My legs burned as I ran, but no matter how far I went, every hallway brought me back to the same place, room 6. The door loomed before me, slightly ajar, the cold seeping out like a physical force. I didn't want to open it. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn and run, but there was nowhere left to go. The intercom buzzed, sharp and deafening. "Come in." The words were different this time. They weren't angry. They were mocking. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door. The air inside was icy, heavy with the stench of rot. A figure stood in the corner, its back to me, its outline too still, too rigid. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The figure didn't move. Not at first. Then it shifted slightly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. I didn't want to see its face, but I knew it was going to turn. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it was learning how to move. My breath caught as its face came into view. It was my face, but wrong. Its eyes were hollow voids, its skin pale and stretched too tight over its skull. The mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that split wider and wider until it looked like its jaw might unhinge. "We've been waiting for you, Evelyn," it said, in my voice, but distorted, layered with something deeper, darker. I tried to step back, but my legs refused to move. The shadows in the room pulsed, oozing across the walls and pooling at my feet. The figure raised a hand, and the darkness surged, wrapping around me like tendrils. My chest tightened, the air sucked from my lungs as the shadows pulled me closer to the entity. "This is where you belong," it hissed, its grin widening impossibly. The walls bled darkness, the room dissolving into an endless void. My vision blurred as fragments of memory flashed before me: my accident, the endless nights in this clinic, and the faces of those who disappeared. This wasn't a clinic. It was a trap. A place that fed on those it ensnared, feeding off fear, regret, and guilt. The shadows swallowed me whole, and the last thing I heard was my own voice twisted, echoing, "Endless, we've been waiting for you." I woke up slumped over the reception desk, the sharp buzz of the fluorescent lights dragging me back to consciousness. My head throbbed as I sat up, disoriented. The clinic was quiet, now eerily so. The intercom was off, and the hallways were still. For a moment I convinced myself it had all been some twisted nightmare. But then I felt it, the weight in my hand. Slowly, I uncurled my fingers and stared at the object, nestled in my palm. The locket. Twisted and charred, its once polished surface blackened as if it had been through fire. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't even remember having it. I stood, my legs weak beneath me, and grabbed my bag. I needed to leave. The air felt suffocating, the quiet too deliberate. As I approached the exit, a nurse appeared at the end of the hallway. I hadn't seen her before, and her uniform looked older, out of place. She walked past me, her eyes locking with mine for just a moment. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. You didn't follow the rules. Did you? She whispered before disappearing down the corridor. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt too tight. I burst through the clinic doors, the fresh air, doing little to quell the pressure in my chest. But as I stepped into the parking lot, the intercom buzzed to life behind me. Evelyn, the distorted voice, dragged out my name, each syllable a claw sinking deeper into my mind. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew it would follow me. It always does. If you dare, share this story. But remember, the more you talk about it, the closer it gets. Are you sure you're alone? Or is something waiting to call your name next?